Great. Well, thank you. I'd really especially like to thank everyone here at Rago for inviting me, and in particular, Marion. It's so wonderful to see somebody who really gets it and understands what we've been trying to do, because when I started this project over 20 years ago, people thought I was insane. Why was anybody paying attention to punk rock, performance art, and postmodern dance? And I thought, well, somebody's got to do it. I had a former curator of books who said that I'm the perfect example of someone who took a dissolute childhood and turned it into a career. And so perhaps that's what I'm going to describe this evening, is how that came about and how we grew to be the largest collection documenting the New York art scene of the 70s and 80s and into the 90s that exists.
You're taller than I am.
Oh, okay.
Put that up a little bit.
Thank you. How's that? I'm going to start just with an image to give you some idea of the kinds of things we have. This is a photo collage by Martin Wong, who is an artist that if you don't know, you should be paying attention to. Martin passed away in 1999 of AIDS, but he left behind a very serious body of work that's suddenly being rediscovered. And the Bronx Museum is going to be doing a major retrospective of his work that's going to open in the next couple of months. It's really a reevaluation of Wong and his work. I especially love these photo collages because they document the Lower East Side and what was there once upon a time that's now completely gentrified and gone. As Miriam said, it was a tough life. I asked Ron Colm, whose collection came very early to the downtown collection, I said, why didn't hippiedom really ever take off in New York City? Because the Summer of Love seems to have lasted for about 6 weeks. And he said, you couldn't drop acid and take the A train. Because if you did in the old days, you would end up dead. And so I always like that, because how many people here were punks? Anybody? Yeah, there are a few of us. Yeah, there are fewer and fewer people who remember. But don't you remember, we hated hippies. We all rejected the hippies. They were that generation or a generation and a half before us, even though some of us were their age. And we just, tie-dye and long hair wasn't going to work. I asked Richard Hell of television, and later Richard Hell in the Voidoids once, why the spiked hair, which he started donning in 1974. And he said by 1974, long hair didn't mean anything anymore, which I thought was really fascinating. I may give a lot of these silly allusions. I've been doing this for so long. I've met a lot of amazing people who've shared their stories with me, and those are stories we're trying to document in the library. What I find fascinating showing this image here in an auction house is this is clearly, in Martin's mind, a sketch. This is something he created when he was working on a painting. I displayed them about 4 or 5 years ago in an exhibition about process and artist papers, and lo and behold, suddenly galleries are constantly wanting to borrow these, and now they're trying to monetize them. In fact, a gallerist asked me if I was willing to sell Martin's collages, which obviously I'm not, because we're a 501(c) historical organization and we're going to keep them, but documents in this environment where the archive has become such a part of art exhibitions are starting to be turned into artworks, whether the artist thought they were or not. And it's just something to keep in mind. It's really quite fascinating. This also shows just Martin's reveling in the beauty of the ugly, something that I believe goes back to Baudelaire, and in fact, the whole downtown scene, if there's one thing that holds it together, because it isn't one scene, it's many overlapping different kinds of scenes that happen in bars and in galleries and various other places on the street. It is this notion of finding the lovely, the exciting, the powerful in what most people would think of as not traditionally beautiful, and yet they did see the beauty there. Oh, somebody's phone's running, I'll get it. Sorry. So I've titled my talk, I'll Be Your Mirror, Building Archives and Museum Collections, and I'm going to talk a lot about our art holdings. Of course, all of you get the reference to the Velvet Underground, I'll be your mirror, reflect what you are. Whether that's exactly possible or not, I'm not going to go into the theory behind it. It's complicated. So I want to start by talking about the history of the Fales Library, just so you understand where we're coming from and how a rare book library in a major academic institution decides to document punk and outsider art in general. So Mr. Fales was a banker here in New York City. Between 1908 and 1956, he amassed a collection of over 50,000 volumes of fiction in his private library. He started collecting in 1908 as an undergraduate at Harvard. He took a course from a scholar named Bliss Perry, and we're pretty sure that Perry was the first person to teach the novel in the American Academy. If you were studying literature, you were studying the classics, and perhaps courses in Chaucer and Shakespeare, but certainly not the lowly novel. It had been thought of as somewhat scandalous in the 18th century, and then in popular culture, and so by the end of the 19th century, it was very much looked down upon, despite the fact that Dickens was selling, tens of thousands of copies of his fiction and making a fortune off of the novel. So Fales takes this course. In the class, he reads Dickens, Trollope, Thackeray, Scott, but also Americans, Paulding, Irving, and Cooper, which is really unusual. I like to tell students that if it was crazy to collect the English novel in 1908, it was insane to collect the American novel. Really not until the past 15 or 20 years has the American novel come into its own. That is the early American novel that Fales was collecting and been seen as important. But he built this collection, starting with the authors they read in the class, and then their literary circles, because that's what Bliss Perry was interested in. I actually went back and read Perry's criticism from the turn of the 20th century. It's really fascinating. It looks a lot like culture studies criticism that would come out starting 30 years ago. He was very much ahead of his time. And de Courcy-Fales based his methodology on the methodology that Perry was proposing. So he gave up on the notion of connoisseurship collecting. This is really very important for us. He said at one point he was interested in getting a copy of every novel published in English during the 19th century, which is crazy, right? I mean, this is bibliomania had clearly taken hold of Mr. Fales, and he spent a good portion of the family fortune on the books, because by the time he had offered the collection to Harvard in 1956, he was at 50,000 plus titles. He had very little competition, however, because there's no canon of the great novel at this point. And a lot of the things he was purchasing were $3 a piece, $1 per volume. But nonetheless, he managed to spend most of the family fortune. If any of you know, the Fales estate was just outside Gladstone. It was called Failton. It was over 1,000 acres. It's where the American Equestrian Association has their offices now. Fales was a great horseman as well as a great hunter and a great lover of art and literature, and this beautiful house that they had. What he did instead was he started to use a documentary strategy for collecting, and that's something that became very important to me in building the downtown collection. So the foundations of the downtown collection are this. When I got to NYU in 1993, NYU had changed dramatically. It was no longer an institution that was, to a certain extent, a commuter school and a night school, which it had always been thought of, the lesser of the schools in Manhattan, Columbia being, of course, the very top. And I worked at Columbia, too, so I can bash Columbia a little bit. Yeah, they were uptown. Who wanted to be uptown? So I was told to fix it, but no one quite knew what fixing it meant. We had a collection of somewhere around 70,000 volumes of fiction. We had a small papyrus collection and about 500 linear feet of archival materials, but really not enough to support PhD level research. And so I looked around and realized that what had attracted me to NYU and what had attracted so many new faculty members was area studies. And by this, I mean American studies, gender studies, performance studies, Asian Pacific American studies. You go on down the list. These were multidisciplinary areas that were looking cross-culturally at issues, and they were engaged often in institutional critique. And I want to take that term out of the art world museum context and make it a broader kind of institutional critique that aligns all of this work with postmodern and post-structuralist theory. And that's all I'm going to say about theory, maybe, unless I go off into Foucault wormhole. But so I went to my dean and said, I think we should document the downtown art scene. And I slipped it in by saying we should look at the writers who are working downtown, because there was a major explosion of fiction writing, of new fiction writing, mostly centered around a magazine called Between C and D, which was issued on fanfold paper. It was created on, I don't even think we called them PCs back then. It was created on a computer and printed out on a series of 9 linked dot matrix printers. So think about printing 500 copies of a magazine on 9 linked dot matrix printers. The noise alone was incredible. It was printed on 4th Street between C and D. And this is 1982. You can imagine what 4th Street between C and D was like in the early 80s. It was pretty grim. So he said, go see what you can find. And so I started to look around and talk with people and try to document the literary scene. The literary scene spilled over into the art scene scene into the music scene. I like to say that in this period, every artist was in a band, because if you look at the number of people who were in bands, it's really astonishing. And they were taking a lot of their energy from the punk scene downtown, from the DIY, the do-it-yourself aesthetic that was going on there. And so I came up with an idea of working around connoisseurship also by using sociograms and looking at who knew whom and in what context they knew that person. So you could look at clubs, you could look at galleries, and you could look at various other physical spaces as ways to organize collecting. And what really I realized a few years later I was proposing was a fusion between the museum, the library, and the archive. And being a good PowerPoint presentation, there's everything that I told you. So, you know, they said, say it, or tell them what you're going to say, tell them, and tell them again. So there it is. There's documentation. And of course, how did we go about this? Well, we were the new NYU at that point, and there were tons of new faculty who had newly minted PhDs in all the areas I was suggesting. I get the downtown size glass. And we had location, because I like to joke that who was at all of these clubs and all of these openings downtown? Chances are it was NYU students, and a lot of them were there. In fact, a project that I've just started is to crowdsource a collection about all the downtown clubs with the alumni from NYU, to get them to send us their memorabilia, tickets, flyers, posters, anything for the clubs, and so that we can document what was going on. Also then to do a big exhibition of clubs and the various styles. We have things from Danceteria and Pyramid, and Palladium, a few of the other clubs, but we really want to expand that collection. This picture is for Katie K. I'm sad that she couldn't be here tonight, because this is Katie K. It's John Sex and the Bodacious Tatas. And Katie was one of the Bodacious Tatas. In fact, I may need Miriam's help. Is she on the... Yes, that's what I thought, absolutely. Because I've only met Katie once at the opening of the downtown show. John Sex's collection is actually fascinating. He was a central figure at the Pyramid and the East Village scene in general. You can see the difference between the sort of 70s, very stripped down, very postmodern, and the glam that would come back in the 80s downtown. John's costumes were all made by April Palmieri, who's one of the other Bodacious Tatas, who still works in the fashion industry. She works for Simplicity Patterns, still doing patterns for women who make their own clothes. And so they were literally rag queens, as we call them, these women who were making these fabulous costumes for John, and just whatever ideas they dreamt up, he dreamt up and they dreamt up, they made for him. April managed to keep his collection after he died of AIDS in 1989 and gave it to us, but we're now in the process of piecing back his collection, as we did with Dean Johnson's collection, through crowdsourcing, through letting people know that we're interested in preserving his history, because he's one of the more colorful characters, I think we can say. So, the downtown scene, what do I mean? I used 1974 as the date when the downtown collection began, when the downtown scene began. Of course, people had been living in lofts in SoHo and Tribeca, and even north of SoHo in the East Village since the 60s, some of them very early 60s, and these were mostly abandoned buildings that had been light industrial buildings. But in 1974, a few things happened. And probably most importantly is that the Loft Law came into being. And what the Loft Law was an attempt by people who were living downtown to have the state government say that you could live in these spaces without being thrown out. And we have the papers of Shel Shapiro, who was in one of the Flux houses downtown, a friend of George Machunas. And Shel was an architect who basically did all of the hard work of showing why these buildings were important and should be landmarked instead of torn down. So these are also the days around when Robert Moses is still trying to bisect Manhattan with a highway. And they were successful. Before that, artists had sprayed A.I.R. on the front of lofts where they were living. Artist in residence, because the fire department wouldn't put out a fire in these buildings if they caught on fire. And then what would happen, they would be burnt, and then people would go in and steal all the plumbing, the copper, to sell it. So in 1974, that changes. 1974, Nixon resigns, which is another positive thing, perhaps. 1974 is also the year in which, I'm thinking of the Bushes, but he's not as evil as the Bushes. Who succeeded Nixon? Sorry. Ford. Yeah, maybe it's my cue to fall off of the stage. At any rate, Ford said to the city, drop dead. He wasn't going to bail them out because the city was almost bankrupt. But to me, one of the most important things that happened in 1974 was on March 30th, 1974, a band called Television played at CBGB's. They had convinced Hilly Crystal to allow them to perform. And of course, if any of you know your punk history, Television is more or less the band about which the term punk was first used. It was Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine and his group performing there. And that's the moment I take for the beginning of punk. It would be a couple of months later that Patti Smith would join them, and pretty soon the whole thing would explode with this kind of outsider music that was about as opposed to the Moody Blues as you could get, and charting something very, very different. Of course, there had been a scene before, and that is the Judson Memorial Church. And you can't look at the downtown scene without understanding what happened at Judson. Going back as far as the 1940s, Judson had an outreach to artists downtown. It was a sort of missionary agenda, and they were very welcoming to people. Judson always had a very progressive religious agenda and political agenda. Everybody asked me when I first started building the collection, do you have Judson? Because they thought Judson was so important. And primarily it was important for three programs that were there. One was the Judson Dance Troupe at Judson Dance Theater, which was created by Yvonne Rainer, Tricia Brown, Lucinda Child, David Gordon, Malcolm Goldstein, Steve Paxton. If you know the postmodern dance world, this is basically the beginnings of postmodern dance. And they were taking classes from Cunningham and Cage. So you have that influence. Of course, there are two other major influences on all of this. Warhol, as Marion said, Warhol's incredibly important for his gestures about art and commerce. And for the poets, Frank O'Hara, and the notion of coterie and natural language and writing about your friends and getting away from the sort of more highfalutin, more elevated language and coming down to something very natural. This was very, very appealing. The beats are important as well. Perhaps not as much as influences in some ways. It's a rather complicated, I think, and perhaps generational relationship with them. Interestingly enough, we have Richard Hell's journal from Patti in 1974. It's the journal that Patti Smith used for the first 40 or so pages, and she gave it to Richard. And then Richard writes in it, including creating a list of first and second tier influences on what he and his friends were doing. And what's conspicuously absent is American modernism. They are looking back to the French, and it's almost all a list of continental intellectuals and artists who they were interested in. So Judson can't be overestimated in terms of its importance. There's a lot said about the difference between SoHo and the East Village in terms of style, and I have a few images to show you that fall into this. In general, I try not to make a big distinction between the two, but there are some things that I think are pretty true. SoHo tended to be more theoretical. It tended to be a little bit more inspired by appropriation and by people like Adrian Piper and these other sort of people working with text. And I'm thinking of, at any rate, So it's a little more theoretical, a little more traditional, more strictly postmodern, maybe. We have the archive of semiotext, which many of you may remember. Semiotext is published the first translations of most of the French and continental critics, like Derrida and Foucault, Baudrillard, Deleuze, and Guattari. So making that connection between the art that was going on downtown and French critical thinking. And you certainly see those influences in punk and in performance. The Lower East Side, the East Village scene, seems to have taken its theory rather than directly from the French. I don't know that John Sex ever actually read Foucault, but certainly he's playing with similar sets of ideas and a lot more sense of play, a little less serious than the SoHo scene. So here's an image of the Loft Law. This is a Babette Mangolt image of a performance by Richard Foreman's troupe in his loft on Wooster Street. Interestingly enough, we have over 50,000 photos in the collection. Many of them are documentation in scare quotes, but they're also by people who've gone on to be major artists who happen to be working as documenting friends' performances. Here is a wonderful photo of the space that would become Art on the Beach. If any of you remember Art on the Beach, Creative Time took over this abandoned space, which was created when they did the excavations for the World Trade Center. They dumped all of the silt and dirt into the Hudson and then left it for about 30 years, barren. And so they created art projects in this space. I love this photo of the Twin Towers. Of course, the club scene in the Lower East Side was documented heavily by the East Village Eye and by other magazines. This is something we've really tried to collect heavily. We have over 600 magazines that were produced downtown, and we're trying always to get complete sets of them. It's very hard. Most people read them and threw them away. But every once in a while, you found somebody who kept everything. This is the first issue of the East Village Eye with James Chance on it, sometimes known better as James White. And you can really see the 80s style here, the 80s sensibility. This is new wave, or in this case, no wave. I talked about Judson Dance. I forgot to mention the other two important places there. The other one was Judson Gallery, which opened in 1956 with Rauschenberg, Oldenburg, and Dine as the three people behind what was going on. They did the first ever installation art piece there called Rago in 1957. And we have extensive documentation of that, including the money that Oldenburg created and had printed that was the currency if you were in Rago. A very, very important early piece. And a church allowing some of the most out there art possible. The other thing that happened in Judson was Judson's Poets Theater, which was run by Al Carmines, and some of the first performances of Gertrude Stein's works were done there, as well as a whole variety of other experimental musicals. Importantly, in 1972, and very controversially, Carmine wrote something called The Faggot, which was performed there and was an early gay rights play. And of course, we have a ton of material about punk rock. Here's a wonderful Polaroid of Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell, and this is 1974. This is a period when you didn't wear other people's clothes. I remember the first time I came home with a used jacket, and my mother was horrified. What was I doing with somebody's old beat-up jacket that probably had lice? And we start to see Richard Hell developing the look that would then be taken to England. Pache and the British people in the audience, but it started here and it went there, and then it came back something very, very different. Where it might have been described as the postmodern ironic or the new wave here, when punk came back, it was politicized in a very, very different way because of the situation in England in the 70s. And of course, performance art. And just to be absolutely upfront about where this came into my consciousness. In college, I hung out with the punk kids, and we were all really interested in what was going on downtown. And I think for me, it really started with Laurie Anderson when I really understood what was going on. And that was a little book called Words in Reverse that was published by Hallballs in Buffalo. And it had some of her performance texts in it. And then very shortly after that, Big Science came out, and that was sort of a moment for many of us in really understanding performance and what was possible. So what have we done? We needed a hybrid organization because we've got artworks, we've got media, we've got printed materials. Artists don't work like other people work. Literary people, their collections are pretty simple. They create literary works, they have versions of them. People come, they want to look at the versions to understand how the work was created. Okay, pretty simple. The great men of history, again in scare quotes, tend to organize things chronologically and by important names, but artists work in a much more fascinating and sloppy way, and they work with objects, and they work with a variety of things that libraries and archives really aren't very good about handling. On the other hand, museums aren't interested in that kind of process because they're interested in the plastic object, the final work. Increasingly in this period, what the final work is being questioned and is coming under a lot of scrutiny. I really love the objects that people use, and very importantly, we have a lot of David Wojnarowicz's objects. His was the first collection to come in that was really complicated, and I think it's because David's work is really complicated, and in as much as he stands for the sort of archetypal downtown artist working in multiple media. He's making films, he's doing performance, he's in video. He was in a punk band called 3 Teens Kill 4, No Motive, and yeah, it was a headline from the Post. And so they used it as the name of their punk band. He's doing painting, he's doing drawings. We have over 5,000 of his photographs. He's sort of the best person to understand what was going on downtown. And he was very much looked up to by most of the artists downtown. So I started working with the Gray Gallery, which is NYU's art library, art museum, to try to develop new methods and new protocols for doing exhibitions that bring these materials together. And our first attempt at this was the downtown show, the New York art scene 1974 to 84, for which we did the book with Princeton University Press. And Lynn Gumpert, who's the director there, and I like to pat ourselves on the back some days and say, you know, we sort of started the thing with putting archival material into the archive, but not just putting it in, but integrating it into the exhibition. And we treated archival documents the same way we treated works, whatever that means, in that exhibition. It's interesting to see how many shows do that now. We loaned over 400 items from our collection this past year to galleries and museums around the world because archives are very hot right now. And what I mean by integrating them in is it's not just a vitrine over here that has a few letters in it that are fanned out to look like you can see all the manuscript. I actually really, I deplore that. What are you going to do, put a tea cozy next to it? You know, don't these documents have enough agency of their own to be standing up there with artworks? I certainly think they do, if they're integrated well by the curators into the show. And it's getting better. And when the next thing we did was the Downtown Pics show, which was a selection of photographs from our collection, which is actually being redone now by Vince Aletti, if any of you know Vince, and we're going to expand it probably into a catalog, and it's going to travel to Europe. And then we started working with a variety of other museums, the new museum, PPOW Gallery, Participant Gallery, Artist Space, to try to put forward this new approach. So here's the cover of the brochure for the downtown show. We chose 74, obviously, for the beginning of the Loft Law, and 84 for the opening of the pop shop, because we thought by the time the pop shop had opened that something had shifted in cultural and how people were thinking about downtown art. It's a pretty good end point, I think. So there are some statistics about Fales today. And the kinds of things that we're collecting: artists' papers, collectives, public art, graffiti, punk, dance, performance, experimental theater, activism. I could go on and on. But what I thought would be more fun is to show you some pretty images of collections and sort of tell you about the breadth of the kinds of things we have. So on the left here is documentation of the Times Square show. And does anybody remember the Times Square show? Okay. So what happens? 1980, a group of artists called Collab, which was short for Collaborative Projects, as an artist collective, took over a former whorehouse in Times Square and cleaned it out and installed for 1 month a group show of artwork from about 100 different artists, none of whom were really known at that point. But there were people like Keith Haring and Jenny Holzer and Basquiat. And as you go down the list, you start realizing, oh, this is really a really important group of people who come together for this time, and they take over this space that couldn't be further away from the museum and the gallery world, and they create their own art space. And they had a store where you could purchase things. This is just an image of the way it was installed. It was installed saloon style, maybe that's appropriate as well. Because of Andrea Callard's papers, Andrea was the secretary for CoLab, we have documentation of everything that happened there. She took photographs of every wall of the space, and she kept detailed notes on everything that was there, everything that was sold, so we can virtually recreate the Times Square show and the feel of being in that space. On the left, we have a painting by Crash from Martin Wong's collection. Martin was very, very heavily involved with the graffiti writers downtown and had many of their notebooks. And I don't know if any of you saw the show about graffiti at the Museum of the City of New York. That was largely drawn from Martin Wong's work. The Museum of the City of New York was somewhat astonished that the show was so popular. And I thought, how can that be? There are going to be people coming into your museum who've never been to the Museum of the City of New York if you do a show about graffiti art. This work by Crash is somewhat unusual in that it's representational, because most New York graffiti writing is in fact letter form and playing with letter form. So I like to play with my old ye olde rare bookie people when they bring their classes in for typography and type history, because I like to show them graffiti as well in terms of type design. It's not usually what they expect. Again, on the left is a photograph of the first year of the AIR Gallery. And this was the first women's collective gallery in New York City, thus the first women's collective gallery. I think this is 1973. And every year after that, they got all the women who were involved in the gallery together to take a photo. And so we have them coming up to today because AIR Gallery is still going. It was a very, very important place for early feminist women artists to get together and promote their own work and promote other work. It has an interesting history because in the early 80s, they nearly collapsed as an organization because some of the women said that there could be no men shown at the gallery. And the SoHo women thought, well, that's ridiculous. Then you're just being like the 57th Street galleries. You know, you're being just as bad. I think it was the big break between, depending on how you determine first and second and third wave feminism, there was a rift happening. And so the SoHo women, including people like Ana Mendieta and others, decided that they were going to pull out of AIR. And so there was a compromise, and they did a show called Women Choose Men, and the women selected works by male artists to actually display at AIR Gallery. Their collection perhaps should be at the Wand collection, which documents feminist artists. It's at Rutgers. But interestingly to me, the current directors, this was a few years ago now, but the more contemporary directors sought out the collection coming to Fales, where it could be much more with people who think of gender as performance instead of as essential. And I think that reflects who sort of won, if you could say it, the problem about whether to show male artists or not, and what is male and female, any rate. Oops. The other image here is David Wojnarowicz. It's a flyer from David's collection. David's collection is over 150 linear feet. So if you imagine a banker's box, that is a linear foot. David, because he had access to Peter Hujar's loft after Peter died, was able to keep everything, including all of his journals going back to his Outward Bound journey when he was 16 years old. It's fascinating to read them because you can actually see a trajectory of the use of maps and questioning just about everything that you could possibly question, from this 16-year-old who'd been sent there because he was a juvenile delinquent to the major works of his career in the late 70s, early 80s, and up into the 90s. Yeah, this is a really important flyer. David said, when I die, don't give me a memorial, give me an action. And they did. ACT UP carried an effigy of his body down 3rd Avenue in a protest. And so this is the call for that protest for David Wojnarowicz. We didn't set out to document the history of the AIDS crisis in New York, but it so devastated the downtown art scene. It was probably the major reason why the scenes came to an end and shifted to someplace else, that we have extensive documentation about the crisis. And our current exhibition in our little gallery, the Tracy Berry Gallery, is called Positive Negative HIV/AIDS, and it documents the positive and the negative activism that happened around AIDS between '88 and '96, so right around the worst period of the crisis. On display are a variety of photos by David Wojnarowicz, by Bill Beitzura, Hunter Reynolds. If any of you know Hunter's work, he has a show up at PPOW Gallery right now. Yeah, Abram Finkelstein, Grand Fury, on and on. It's a really great show. So here are 2 creative time pieces. I mentioned creative time and showed you the space for art on the beach. This one is actually on the beach down where the World Trade Center used to stand. After they built Battery Park City, which was how they developed that space, they moved to Queens, and the piece on the other side is a beautiful piece. It's a bridge that you can walk over that was a part of the installation in Queens. And I just love this image of the young boy walking on the Manhattan skyline. More graffiti on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a film still from a film called Beehive by Frank Moore. Frank Moore is another of these artists who had an incredible career. His life was cut short at age 40 from AIDS. He's virtually forgotten until we did preservation on this film, because we've been doing preservation on our media, and started showing it. And then someone decided maybe they should look at his paintings again. The Speroni Westwater represents the estate. And we did an exhibition with the Gray about Frank Moore's work, and suddenly everybody's interested in him again. And bless Holland Cotter, who really understands this work. He did a great review about Frank's paintings. I don't know if any of you saw the exhibition, but Frank Moore's work is really, really quite amazing. Sort of new wave on psychedelics. Here are 2 other artists. The piece on the left is by Robert Blanchin, and it's called Stains. Blanchin died very young. I think it's best to consider him a queer conceptual photographer, because he did technically work in photography, but he set up various kinds of conceptual frames for the photography and then documented them in his photography. I particularly like this piece because it's about the actual problems of living with HIV. And the other image is photo documentation, and this is where we differ. I have art photography on one hand, whatever that is, and I have documentation. This is David Wojnarowicz on his deathbed, and this is with his partner Tom, and David would die a few minutes after this. Of course, we document the culture wars, because the culture wars were fought over downtown art. Mapplethorpe, the NEA4, Martha Wilson and Franklin Furness, these are all of our people. So on the left, I have David Wojnarowicz's image with his lips sewn shut. It's not real. I know everybody thinks it's real. It's not real if you look really closely, but it's certainly an image people remember from the culture wars. And ACT UP, the Read My Lips campaign, which is actually not an ACT UP campaign, that was a Queer Nation campaign. But the Queer Nation was an outgrowth of ACT UP. This was actually sponsored by Creative Time, a Safer Sex ad. One of the things that we can't be shy about if you're interested in the downtown collection is expressions of sexuality. They're everywhere. It's funny for me now to show these to students because they're horrified at the explicit sexuality of the images. We've become so conservative, which is it's really too bad. So, recent acquisitions. My curator, or my archivist, my senior archivist, Lisa Darms, has started a Riot Girl collection, continuing on the history of radical punk performance into another generation. She acquired Kathleen Hanna's papers. Kathleen was her college roommate, and so we now have one of the largest collections about Riot Girl that's out there. We received the Gay Cable Network collection, which documents the AIDS crisis from 1982 on, so the first footage of anybody talking about AIDS in the media, plus just documenting downtown culture at large. We just got Vivian Goldman's collection. I don't know if any of you know Vivian. Vivian was the person in journalism who probably did more to promote punk rock and reggae and the overlap between reggae and punk in Britain than anyone else. And she was close to Bob Marley. She knew everybody in the scene. She wrote about them all. Her collection contains over 3,000 vinyls, including hundreds and hundreds of 45s. And these are the kinds of things that DJs would get that nobody else would get, because chances are they were never distributed. They were produced, some of them, as she said, and I actually saw one of these the other day, that had a potato stamp used to print the imprint on the 45, on the label, because these are totally DIY bands. Eric Bogosian, you all know who Eric is for his performance work. Artist Space, the oldest collective artist space in the country, has given us their archive. The Exit Art Archive came in. All of our work tends to be political, but then I don't believe there's any art that's not political. It's all nestled in cultural history at some moment, and that means it's nestled in a politics. Exit Art, of course, brought to the fore art that it was engaged politically. And Jeanette Engbergman and Papo Colo were at some of the very best people at doing this. When Jeanette passed away a few years ago, the Exit Art board decided that they would close the space. And Jeanette had already said that she would like the collection to come with us, because we could contextualize it. The same thing happened with PS 122, the Performance Space 122. Where we have their complete documentation. So basically anybody who wants to study performance art needs to come to us. And just recently, I'm really honored to announce this, Triple Canopy chose us as the place to work with them to preserve their collection, which is 99.99% born digital. Everything is on servers. I don't know if you're familiar with Triple Canopy, but they've been in operation for 10 years, and they're probably the single best magazine that's about art and theory and culture that exists, and it's solely online. So a truly amazing organization. They've pushed the technology for online journals to the edge, so they're so far beyond what preservation can do at this point that we've partnered with them to try to preserve as much of their collection as we can, so we're very much seeing it as an ongoing project. So just a little bit to close. We're really heavily used. 2,200 patrons may not seem like a lot of people who come through and use our collection, but in terms of archival holdings, we're about twice the number of patrons that most collections of our size see. We had a record year for acquisitions at 1,554 linear feet. That's just how archivists measure things. This is all because of the exhibitions that we've been doing this with the Gray Gallery and with other places, and people understand that we're really trying to document this moment as completely as possible. You don't care about my staffing, that's for librarians. But teaching, we taught classes to over 3,000 students last year, and these are people who bring their classes in to talk about, say, punk rock, or what do I have this week? I have one about the culture of work. And so they want to talk about food studies, because we have this other collection. We have 60,000 cookbooks in the food studies collection. And so I'm going to be talking to them about all manners of work and about the Great War. I'm going to be showing them Eric Maria Remarque's manuscripts for All Quiet on the Western Front and talking about the changes in labor that happened because of the war. So you get a sense of some of the breadth. Exhibitions, we do 3 each year, focusing on our collections. We're going to be doing a major Wojnarowicz exhibition next fall in conjunction with the Whitney show. They asked us if we would do something from his papers. And we do a series of events promoting the collections. So why do we do all of this? Because I was afraid that downtown history was going to get lost when I got there. I didn't realize until a few years later that the fire in my belly to collect this stuff came from the fact that one of 2 gay men in New York City was HIV positive when I took over the collection at Fales. And because there was no multiple symptom treatment at that point, you had a life expectancy of 6 months. And so years later, I realized that's maybe why I was so intent on building this. Though my current dean, when she came in, said, "Why are you wasting your time building a collection about a gay man who died, an angry gay man who died of AIDS?" And she meant David Wojnarowicz. And I just kind of looked at her and went, because it's important. And she's finally come around to seeing that David's important. Didn't hurt that the Whitney's doing a retrospective. But a lot of New York gets lost, and especially a lot of work from these people because they were living close to the knives, as Wojnarowicz said. They didn't have a lot of money. They were making things up with very little support. They didn't have much chance of the art market paying any attention to them at this period. And then too many of them died too young. This is a beautiful photograph by Peter Hujar, by the way, of the Lower East Side. And then this is the other reason. We lost huge numbers of collections to Sandy because the low-lying areas were the cheap areas, and that's where these people lived. And if you had stuff in the basement, it got flooded. And printed matter is just one of 1,000 horror stories I could tell you about what was lost in Sandy. It did a huge amount of damage to trying to preserve the downtown work. Luckily, NYU sits high up in the middle of the island, so we didn't have any loss, though the medical library was completely destroyed at NYU in Sandy. So there was an urgency to protect this kind of work, which was already endangered from the moment it was created. And so that's all I have to say. I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you for listening.